for joining us at the Project on Political Communication Ethics discussion about ethics of campaigning, running for office in the middle of COVID-19, the coronavirus, and generally in pandemics as across the globe, and certainly here in the US, it's being felt very immediately. We have with us today for this conversation, our first ever conversation of the site, former Secretary of Agriculture, former member of the House of Representatives, former head of the Motion Picture Association of America, too many other affiliations to list, currently Vice President for the Congress programs at the Aspen Institute. Dan Glickman is with us. We've got Shane DiApril with us, co-owner of Campaigns and Elections, veteran reporter, covered a number of campaigns for several organizations, several outlets. And his job day to day is to serve as the main trade association information gatherer, the guy to go to for campaigns around the country, from city council on up. Campaigns and Elections, and Shane in particular, have shown a commitment to ethics throughout, for forever. Most recently, they featured writings about ethics in Campaigns and Elections, speakers about ethics, and have co-sponsored events about ethics in campaigning here in Washington. Finally, Professor Jeff Brand, JD, PhD, professor in the philosophy department, affiliated faculty member at the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy at the George Washington University. And his field is applied ethics. He's the guy here who will actually bring the intellectual heft and depth to what we're talking about. So thank you all for joining us. I want to lead with a pretty basic, broad question. What are the ethics of this moment? And are the ethics of this moment different than before? Have things changed? Or is this like ethics or ethics and the moment doesn't really matter? Secretary Glickman, I'd like to kick it off with you.
Well, there's this oldest slogan: for every complicated problem, there is a simple and a wrong solution. And there is no simple answer to your question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is, in a period of a national pandemic, it's an obligation of elected officials to do no harm. And by that, I really mean physical harm. So the very nature of campaigning, and as an old politician, is to hug, touch, feel, and just surround yourself with people all the time. Try to convince them, try to love them, try to have them love you, and do all those things, touchy-feely type of things. That's been complicated a bit by all the media that we have. Well, today, it's just not possible. So politicians have recognized that they can't conduct campaigns in the same way, or if they do, they're harming their fellow human beings. And that just creates a challenge that I've never seen before. And even, you go back to the Depression of the 1920s and 30s, it wasn't a public health challenge, it was an economic challenge. And we've seen nothing like this before in the history of America. I'm not saying we can't adapt to it, but the number one criteria is not to harm the people that you want to get your votes from.
So Shane, you've been watching this, you're watching races nationally. I'm sure your members are coming to you and saying, what do I do? What's your take on the ethics of this moment?
Yeah, we've had so many conversations over the past week with campaign professionals and kind of going through really how they are adapting to the moment in terms of changing their approaches, fundraising plans, door-to-door canvassing plans. I think the one important thing to think about here is not just the things that campaigns no longer can do. As the Secretary mentioned, yes, door-to-door canvassing not happening right now. Face-to-face outreach, campaign rallies, the sort of really important tactile parts of campaigning are an impossibility right now. But I think it's important when you think about the ethics of this to also be talking about within your campaign, why you're not doing these things. It's not just because of people's fears, right? It's not just because people don't want to answer the door. It's because you as a campaign have an obligation to ensure the safety of your volunteers, ensure the safety of your campaign staff, their health and well-being as well. So it's not just that you wouldn't be able to have the success going door to door, but it's that you can't put your volunteer in harm's way by doing that, right? Just as you can't put the general public in harm's way. So I do hope that, and I know certainly from some folks we've spoken to, that these conversations are happening on campaigns, that they're not just thinking about okay, if we can't do A, then what do we shift to? But they are thinking about the ethics of this moment in a proactive way, and that's a really positive thing for campaigns.
But Jeff, you think and write about this for a living. You're affiliated with the Trachtenberg School, so you've got part of your life on sort of the real world applications, but your background is sort of the big think. As a philosopher and an ethicist, what's your read?
Well, I would certainly echo everything I think that Dan and Shane just said. But to get back to your original question, do ethics change? Well, first principles don't change, right? Whatever those may be, we might argue about them, but they're out there and they don't change. But radically different situations may call for radically different middle level or low level principles, the kinds of rules of thumb that you live by day to day, right? And some of those rules are going to be specialized to political campaigns, right? So I think in this moment, what I would like to see candidates say to their staff is something along the lines of, my constituents are more important than my victory, right? So even if I'm one of these people, Joe Biden, for example, who revels in the kind of touchy-feely techniques that Dan was talking about, and may very well feel that he's now handicapped, that he has to be prepared to say, I think publicly, public health is more important even than my victory. And I'm sure that's going to be a difficult thing for him to say. But I think that's what the moment really calls for. But philosophically, are we suddenly in completely uncharted ethical territory? No. There are basic moral principles that apply in wartime, right? In natural disasters, in ideological contests, and those don't change.
Dan, you've run for office a number of times, 9-term member of the House of Representatives. If Jeff Brand came to you and said, Congressman, I need you to campaign differently and put other things ahead of your victory, what would you say?
Well, you didn't say I lost the 10th time, so probably I needed the professor to help me in that situation. Well, look, we still, as a democratic country, have an obligation to try to get our messages out and keep our political system running appropriately and with the right principles that our founding fathers agreed on. So you have to adapt. You have to figure out what other kinds of ways are there that you can do it that do no harm. And obviously social media, the kind of things we're doing right now, has some applicability. It's never been used broadly in the sense that we may have to use it in the future. And there are innovative techniques and new technologies and new companies that are trying to figure out how you can communicate directly with groups of constituents that we've never seen before. I think back, my dad was a Depression era baby. He lived during the 20s and 30s, and he remembers Franklin Roosevelt campaigning, and he campaigned almost exclusively through we'd call some sort of national media. It was different then, but it was newspapers and newsreels but he did not have the physical capability of actually going out and touching the flesh as much as anything else. But he used the power of the bully pulpit to campaign. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that. I think you've seen Andrew Cuomo talking in that way right now as governor of New York. Other governors have done that, use their moral force to get ideas across, particularly at a time of high uncertainty that we're in today. So, but I don't have all these new techniques, but there are, our country is a very creative place, and a lot of fertile ideas are germinating right now about how best to communicate. And it's just going to have to be a little bit different, at least for a while, maybe permanently, but at least for a while, at least through this election. But we can't use this as an excuse not to campaign. We can't use this as an excuse not to engage in discussion of major ideas affecting the country.
Before I get to the nitty gritty, because there are some really nitty gritty questions, I think here, I want to come back to Jeff and ask the big question. Do leaders have an ethical obligation to remind us who we are as a country in a moment like this? To say we all come together. Do they have an obligation to praise and build up trust in places like the Centers for Disease Control and the FDA? Is there an ethical obligation beyond the campaign of the moment that our leaders have?
The short answer is yes, Peter. They emphatically do have an obligation that goes beyond the obligation that an ordinary citizen has. And this includes an obligation to anticipate unforeseen consequences, to try to anticipate unforeseen consequences, and to take more responsibility for the indirect effects of your actions than maybe you or I or even a private business owner would have. I think there's also an obligation on the part of people running for office to model the behavior that they'd like to see in everyone. So not just to remind us who we are, but to show us through the way they conduct themselves and the tactics they choose and the behaviors they choose to show us who we want to be, right?
So Shane, what do you think?
It's modeling.
Yeah, I think one of the most difficult things right now for folks who are running campaigns and for political consultants is figuring out what do we do with our messaging, right? And that cuts across everything. Let's start with something that is so fundamental to modern campaigning, which is fundraising. For the most part, right now, you have got divergent opinions on. I spoke to just the other day. I spoke to a digital fundraiser who works on the Democratic side of the aisle, and she said that most of her clients right now are not comfortable with any digital fundraising. They're not comfortable with email fundraising at all. To the extent that they're very concerned about how that email and that ask for money may be perceived. So we've got to let a little bit of this play out before we really kind of have some data on how you can start communicating and how campaigns can start asking again. Now, that being said, there are plenty of campaigns that are still raising money right now. There are plenty of campaigns that are still sending those fundraising asks. I think the way to the ones to look to examples for, and I've seen a number of really nicely framed ones over the past week. Folks are using their email lists as a very soft ask. Subject line something like "checking in during this difficult time," right? Giving them an opportunity to perhaps share a story of how this is affecting their family, their own lives, and create engagement that way, as opposed to the hard ask, and then kind of move back into that hard fundraising ask later. But that's the most difficult piece of this puzzle, right? Whether it is fundraising, whether it's communicating via social media, whether it's advertising digitally or traditionally, what is the right thing to say in this moment that does not turn people off, that is communicating honestly and responsibly? And it's an enormous challenge.
Well, I want to ask, this raises a very specific ethical question. Is it okay to ask for money for a candidate campaign in a moment when everybody else needs money? I live in downtown DC, and bars and restaurants on my block or block from me are gonna close, right? Boys and girls clubs need money, hospitals, everybody needs money. Like, should somebody be raising money when there's so many other urgent needs?
Well, I'd say the answer is yes, if for our political system to continue. Now, you may not be able to raise the same quantity of money, and you may need to raise it differently, but our democracy depends upon competition of ideas, and that requires some degree of what I call responsible conflict. And in order to get that across, you have to have the resources to buy the time to do what we're talking about doing today. But it has to be done sensitively. We may see a lowering of the rhetoric, the really hot, negative type of rhetoric we've seen before. It's interesting. I've watched a little bit of the debate on this package that Congress is dealing with right now. And while there's been some partisanship associated with it, it seems to be tempered a bit by the hardship that people are going through. The other thing I would tell you is I do give money to candidates, and it hasn't stopped. I've just looked at my iPhone, and instead of getting 50 requests a day, I'm getting 46 requests a day. So it's not ending. It defies the laws of nature to believe that people will stop raising money during this time.
Jeff, Dan brings to mind something that I know is important to you, and that's how we argue, and the importance of respectful competition. At your recommendation, I bought a book called Ethics for Adversaries, which is a terrific and interesting read. What about this idea that we have an obligation to continue to have a robust robust political debate, which even involves asking for money that could otherwise go to relief efforts or unemployment funds or whatever?
Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy with Dan's recurring point now that we have an obligation to keep the political system going, to keep debate going. It's not free. I would certainly not want to see any candidate say, forget about the political process. This crisis is too important. Just give all your money to immediate relief efforts. I do think that some kind of acknowledgement in the ask, right, in the messaging of the fundraising, some kind of acknowledgement that there are other priorities, but if you can afford to do so, I'm making up this language. Right? If you can afford to do so, a contribution to help your community as well as a contribution to my campaign, and then link it up somehow to concerns that your campaign is already authentically concerned about, but that maybe relate to the moment. But I think Shane really expressed well the difficulty of this moment and trying not to be exploitative or tone deaf in the way those asks go forward. But no, you can't shut it down. I think we would forget a little bit about who we are if we said no more politics. And I've been reading people talking about other crises that have taken place at election time. A lot of them local or state level, not national. But we've never postponed a federal election, and I don't think we should start now. And by the same token, I don't think we should halt the process now.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up, Jeffrey, on that point about, kind of the way you make the ask, particularly in this moment. There are things that I'm sure all of us have seen over the past few cycles that I think are gray at best, right, from email fundraisers. There is a lot of kind of hair on fire, give $5 now, or the kind of world will end, right? There's a lot of these sort of final notice emails that fundraising organizations send out, which I think are unethical in the best of times, frankly. For anybody, and I can't imagine that people are at this moment. I would hope they aren't, considering that kind of sort of tone and approach right now, especially when so many small dollar donors are folks who are going to be out of work for a period of time. They may be, hourly wage employees. It may be folks who are completely unable in this moment to give. There are a couple of suggestions. One that I thought was really interesting from a Democratic fundraiser who suggested last week that folks in this moment allow people the opportunity to be temporarily removed from their fundraising email lists. Send an email that says, listen, we know that you may be facing economic hardship or healthcare hardship at the moment. If you don't want to be receiving these communications from us, we'll opt you out for the next X period of time. That's, I think, a terrific idea, right? Because it allows you to, engage with those folks later on, but also you are expressly saying to somebody, we do care about the situation you're in, and we don't want to be hammering you over the head right now, even though the reality is for us, we still need to be sending out these communications and raising this money. And the last thought quickly is organizations can use their lists for good in this moment, right? We've seen Bernie Sanders do it on the national level, where his fundraising team raised millions for a number of charities. I've seen it on the local level where folks have sent out to smaller email lists to try to raise money for local food banks and local charities that are assisting in this moment. So think about how you could use your assets for good. It's a great thing to be doing at this moment too.
Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good idea. I would have to say that, I've been involved in the anti-hunger movement for a long time. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for people to help in what I call the basic human needs side of the picture. But the scale of what government does dwarfs everything that's done on the private nonprofit sector. It's important because it's community-based. So I think you can do some of that, but I still think it's important where people can do it, to participate in the political system, because it make a difference about what the size of the SNAP program will be, or whether the school lunch program will continue, because all these things relate to what's actually happening to people, on the field. I was noticing that one of the discussions had to do with, do we bail out the airline industry or not? And they have about 650,000 employees in the United States, or some enormous amount, and a lot of people rely on it. Our whole economy relies on it. And I'm thinking, okay, if you want to try to influence that discussion or that debate, do you just stay out of politics because times are tough now and a lot of people are hurting? I don't think so. I think you have to calibrate it down to what Shane said. You can do it much more sensitively, but you can't just remove yourself from our political system, because the system can do a lot of damage to you as well.
I want to build on that, because another question that then gets raised, that people are raising, is how do you politicize this moment? Like, we're just playing politics with tragedy. But as you said, SNAP matters. And that was as Secretary of Agriculture, and obviously the Farm Bill was sort of your thing, and SNAP is part of that. You've got ties to healthcare policy. You've got ties to Head Start programs, which is run out of HHS. One could draw an easy line to climate, right? Like, you think this is bad, wait till the stuff that's been buried in the ice caps for millions of years starts hitting the air. Where's the line, though, between an appropriate political argument from COVID-19 and just kind of ganging up, or just kind of an inappropriate or an unseemly political line? You know what I'm asking? Does that make sense? Like, where's the line between appropriate and inappropriate politicization of this crisis?
It's a really good question, Peter. I don't have a quick answer for that. It would maybe be easier to deal with a what if, right? Some language, right? So here's how we're thinking of messaging this next time, right? And we're going to try to put the response to the pandemic on the Republicans. That's going to be our talking points. What do you say? What do you say about that? Is that okay? Especially if presumably it's wrong if you don't sincerely believe it. But if you sincerely believe, for example, that the current administration bears some responsibility for the pandemic we're in, is it acceptable? As I know, some of Biden's spokespersons have said, we're gonna hang not the pandemic but the response. We're gonna hang it on the Trump administration. I'm not sure what I think about that, because I assume they believe it sincerely. But I'm very curious what Shane and Dan think about that. Is that excessive politicization of this moment?
Well, I just say yes, if it's calibrated correctly. If you were to come out and say Donald Trump has caused the coronavirus, that's of course ridiculous. But if you argue that the response of his team, his administration, his management operations have contributed to this effort, I don't think that's an inappropriate thing to say. I do think it would be helpful to say what you would do in response to that. But after all, this is a government that hopefully operates competently. And if the government isn't operating competently, somebody has to say that, and it belongs in the political scene. It's okay if opinion writers write about it in the New York Times or Washington Post, but I don't think it's inappropriate that shouldn't be part of the discussion. I think the real issue is the times we're in require you to use more sensitive language, more respectable language. Maybe one of the positive things, if there is any positive, what we're going through now, is that people are hurting so much that maybe we can lower our rhetoric a little bit as we talk about these issues. Maybe that's wishful thinking.
Yeah,
Jane,
yeah. There's obviously no easy answer to this question, right? And I think that one of the challenges here is that everybody as we look at everything, unfortunately, these days, is going to look at this through their partisan glasses, right? So, you know, a Republican elected official is going to make what they think is a perfectly reasonable and you know, cogent argument about why Democratic priorities, perhaps as it relates to the relief bill, are not appropriate. And there are going to be any number of people who are going to see that as excessively partisan and not something that somebody should be attacking somebody on in this moment. Same thing on the Democratic side, right? You know, I've seen, as I'm sure you all have, you know, emails come into my inbox about how Republicans are, you know, politicizing coronavirus relief, and that actually, you know, they're trying to sort of, you know, pick corporate winners at this moment, right? And for Democrats, that is a very legitimate issue, and it's something that they feel is responsible to be messaging. Not everybody is going to feel that way, depending on what partisan lens you're looking at this through. So I think it's a really difficult question to answer, particularly at a time when we are so fragmented. And Peter, I know you've talked about this multiple times, and you spoke about it at you know, our conference that you spoke at not so long ago. The real concern here is we're at a moment in American life when trust in our fundamental institutions of government are frighteningly low. And I think what's really important now for elected officials and candidates is not to be doing anything that you know, casts doubt on healthcare professionals and the advice that's coming from, you know, organizations like, or agencies like the CDC, and, you know, organizations of government that we need to be relying on, that we need to have public trust in. That's one of my biggest concerns, that this gets politicized to the point that we continue tearing down institutions that we need Americans to trust.
Jeff, is this an ethical question from your perspective?
It absolutely is. And I'm glad that Shane used one of my favorite words, which is trust, because I think we have at this moment, and this predates the pandemic, we have a trust deficit in this country. I think trust is one of the most critical national resources that we have. And it certainly seems to be at low ebb, certainly in my lifetime. It seems as though trust is at low ebb. And I think people who want to lead us have an affirmative obligation to periodically, regularly make not just gestures, but really concrete moves that try to restore, try to kind of get our deficit and turn our deficit into a surplus, or at least you know, a zero balance. Because right now we have a deficit. And this actually ties into some things that Dan and Shane have been talking about, in that I don't think people need to stop saying the policy related things they want to say, right? Legitimate policy criticism of your opponent has got to be, it's got to be as welcome today as ever. But I think you can leaven that. You can soften that. You can enhance that with some gestures that rebuild trust. Some of those are going to have to be, yes, rebuilding trust in our institutions. I think on the liberal Democrat side, there needs to be some trust building that goes the other direction, that has to do with not demonizing Trump supporters. I would love to see the Democratic candidates for president take a strong stand that Trump supporters are your neighbors. In many cases, they're your friends, they're your fellow countrymen, and we need to look out for them just as much as we look out for our own. That might be trite. It might sound unrealistic, but I think there are really important rhetorical moves that candidates can make to remind us that we're one country, and that we need some truth and reconciliation. And this is the most difficult moment, I think, to do that. But it's also an opportunity, and I think politicians on both sides could be doing more of that than they have been. And once you've done that, then I think, of course, you make your legitimate policy criticism. You take the Bernie Sanders line. If we had national health care in the first place, we'd be in a stronger position right now. Legitimate point, but not in isolation.
So Dan, you've been an elected official, having to go through these campaigns and make these arguments. You've been Secretary of Agriculture, where if these folks are right, part of your job was to stand up for these core American values. And I know that at Aspen, you're spending a lot of time figuring out how we can get back to a point of more respectful dialogue, maybe tone it down a bit. What do you think hearing this conversation?
Well, first of all, I agree with what was just last said, this concept of respect, which, by the way, I would like to see other validators like the faith-based community really talking much more about this than they do right now. But I think it's, you know, it's certainly really, really important to recognize that we're not enemies of each other. But that requires leadership. And I want to go back to this issue of leadership. So I go back again historically to the Depression, because for whatever reason, that's impacted my blood a lot, because my grandfather and my father used to talk about it all the time. And those are the times that we really were in a country in just the deepest despair of the world. I'm not sure we're there yet, but we could be. We don't know yet. And it required the leadership at all levels, but particularly at the presidential level, whose goal was to bring people together. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. We're all part of the same team. And that languaging, that rhetoric has been largely absent from our politics for the last 30 or 40 years. There are a lot of reasons for that we could go into. And so I think that the opportunity now, and I saw it a little bit in the debate on this stimulus package, this last $2 trillion thing that hopefully will get passed, is that people were talking by and large not in ad hominem terms. And by the way, and I'll just be frank, it's very difficult with a president who talks in ad hominem terms all the time to try to figure out how the best way is to run this country in an ethically sound and positive way to keep our values going. But there are some good signs on the horizon. But this respect has to start at leadership levels, and then it's got to work its way down. And there's a lot of great things happening at the community base too. It's not all just top down. It's a lot of it is bottom up. But back in his prehistoric time when I served in Congress, I would tell you that by and large, we respected our colleagues on the other side. I mean, yeah, they had a lot of problems and there were a lot of issues and everything else, but it was nothing like it is today.
So Shane, you're part of that bottom-up world, right? I mean, your constituents, your members, the folks who come to your conferences are running for city council, they're running for mayor, they're running for governor. Are they echoing this? Are they lowering the tone? Are they doing what Dan wants them to do?
Yeah, I think that right now they're trying to figure out exactly what to do, right? And it's much more challenging for folks who are lower down the ballot, right? So if I'm a congressional campaign or I'm a statewide campaign and I have more resources, well, naturally, as a result of that, I've already got a sizable contact list, right? I already have some pretty good consultants on my roster. I can fundraise online, and I've probably been doing that quite a bit in the last few months. If I'm running for, city council, if I'm running for some city office, even some county office, the most important thing to me is fundraising in person, right? Face to face, right? Because I don't really have the tools to fundraise online effectively. Nobody's giving to me through Act Blue, right? And so it's a tremendously challenging time for those individuals, because that sort of in-person face-to-face campaigning, which is so important for folks, at a local level, is an impossibility for them right now. Another thing that, we're hearing a lot of are, signature gathering, right? Petitions to get on ballots. Folks are unable to do that right now, not just for the health and safety of your own staff and volunteers, but for the general public, right? You're not going to set up a voter registration table outside of a grocery store. You're not on college campuses right now registering voters and organizing and having people sign petitions. Folks across the country are having trouble getting on ballots, smaller elected officials in smaller races. The challenges are just, there's every facet of campaigning right now that is a tremendous challenge. So I think for the small folks that you're talking about, the most immediate need is figuring out, okay, how can I even continue? And then once they figure out how they can continue, the larger questions over what should I be saying, what should my tone be like, what can I do and can't do, then those can get addressed.
Let's talk, I'm glad you brought up signature gathering, because a lot of this stuff we can do remotely. There are creative ways for Zoom chats, for example, but how do you, if you need to get on a ballot, how do you get on the ballot? Do you say, you know what, this isn't my moment? Do you wait 2 years? I had an idea you buy a lot of pens with your campaign slogan and you have people pull a pen out of a box. Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, so I don't have a great answer. I would love to know this from a ballot access lawyer or somebody who works on these issues. But my understanding is twofold. One, that doing this virtually in almost every state is really not a possibility. Now I know in some states you can pay a fee to get yourself on the ballot in lieu of signatures. I don't know, the particulars of that state by state. It's just not an area of my expertise. But yeah, it is an enormous challenge. And, just like every other area of campaigning right now, you've got folks, smart digital folks, who are looking at, okay, how can we take a traditionally offline interaction and bring it online? Can we do that quickly? Can we do that legally? So I know there are folks looking at this right now, but if you are a candidate trying to get X number of signatures on a ballot petition, you're having a real hard time right now.
So Dan, somebody comes to you and says, Congressman, you've knocked on a lot of doors in your day. What do I do? What do you tell them?
Well, I'm just my hometown of Wichita, Kansas. I noticed that the new mayor, who's about a third my age, has figured out a way to communicate with constituents. He has hundreds, if not thousands, of followers, and advising them on a variety of things in terms of from social distancing to how to buy their food, to how to get groceries if they don't have any money, to healthcare things. And I noticed that he's been advising people on voter participation and registration. Some states do have very creative ways where you can register online, and I see that Senator Wyden and others are talking about voting online, which is a possible thing that will happen to this. I mean, I think that's necessary, although I must tell you, I've been a little bit concerned about some of this early voting because a lot of stuff happens between the time you early vote and the election takes place. You could have 4, 5, 6 weeks where the world could come to an end during that time period. And so everything's tricky. Nothing is without ease, but we're a pretty innovative country. And I think we'll come up with ways to keep people, to get them access into not only voting, but participating much more directly in the political process.
So now, Jeff, you and I are two of those people who are not on college campuses at the moment. Those, hotbeds of volunteers that Shane was talking about. Are you talking to your colleagues or students? Like what's the political involvement level? How are you telling kids to get involved or stay involved, or what's that feel like?
Well, I don't teach at the moment because I'm on sabbatical, so I don't have a following of students who I'm contacting online to teach online classes. I'm certainly in touch with my colleagues, and we do talk about politics and political engagement and the sort of the crisis of the moment. I think this is a case where people who were targeting college students as constituencies have to understand the enormous stress that they're under, enormous disruption for young people who, in many cases, have had a fairly smooth path through college because the economy's been good and their lives are completely disrupted now. Now, will that translate into greater mobilization come November? Perhaps, but I think right now, students across the country, voting age students across the country, are highly focused on how to get their semester wrapped up. So I think everyone just needs to be conscious of that. I don't know whether there are sort of ethical limitations on how one might engage with that population right now. I think there's just practical limitations, and we have to be aware that everyone's bandwidth is finite. and everyone's attention is limited. But this is a question of being sensitive and realistic. I don't know that it raises a specific ethical issue.
Are there other ethical questions that people should be considering during this time?
Well, I think there are tons of them. This is addressed to me, Peter, and one I'd sort of like to throw back to the people with actual experience in electoral politics on our panel here, because I'm not one of those. But I think it's always useful to ask oneself before one takes up a tactic, how would I feel if my opponent did this, if our situations were reversed? And you often can perform that little thought experiment. And so in the current moment, you could ask yourself, all right, I think there's actually an electoral advantage to me of using the moment in some way. I'd like to ask Shane and Dan, are there things that you wouldn't want your opponent to do, that you would stop yourself from doing for that reason, vis-a-vis the pandemic?
Well, I can't forget when Bob Dole was running for president, and I forgot. He said he's got to stop lying about my record, and it turned out that well, maybe it wasn't such a lie. It was kind of a political exaggeration a bit and everything else. But I do think this concept of the golden rule of politics, which is do unto others what you'd want them or not want them to do unto you, is something that people can think about. But that requires voices of validation that encourage that. It requires a citizenry that kind of wants to see good behavior modeled. And there are organizations out there now that are watching this, that are grading politicians based upon the hostility of their rhetoric and the relevance of their tone and their message. And that's an area where I think the American people need to be encouraged to expand. And this is another area where I think the faith-based community has been, to my experience, missing in action on this point. I mean, what's the purpose of religion? It's to get people to behave in accordance to higher principles, the Ten Commandments, the Golden Rule, and all these things. And I sometimes get amused that I watch a lot of, sometimes I get a kick out of watching these preachers on TV. I rarely see anybody talking about how to behave. And it's usually a much more hostile message. And there's too much of that in our society today. And so validators, people, business leaders, corporate leaders, faith-based leaders, they have to also be part of this solution as well. I mean, leadership is not just in politics per se, it's at the school level. And it's just a thought I've had that it just doesn't come out of the blue. These things are endemic to society as a whole.
So, Shane, I want to ask you a question that you asked me in Atlanta about a month ago. Why should somebody, Secretary Glickman's right, Jeff's right, why should some candidate behave in an ethical manner?
Right. And this goes back for me to the old, well, my opponent is doing it, right? The other side is doing it. This notion that we have now that I hear repeated and have heard repeated from political operatives for years now, you've got to fight fire with fire, right? And this is one of the things that, concerns me about this particular moment, because even though we are in a unique moment in American life right now, we can't really believe, I don't believe, speaking for myself, that all of a sudden the rules of campaign politics are going to just disappear and folks are going to behave in drastically different ways. Ultimately, I don't have a lot of hope that occurs, right? I think that once people get really into campaign and election mode here and start messaging and the negative attacks start coming, I think we do sort of regress a bit back to the place that we were a year ago, 2 years ago, in the midterm elections, right? So in the best of times, Peter, as you know, campaign professionals don't like talking about ethics. And right at this moment, I think it's a conversation that you really have to force. So, I mean, I think to directly answer your question, there's not a good rationale at the moment for folks to not, in a campaign context, take advantage of this situation unless they see that it is harmful to their candidate or campaign, right? And I think that's the lens they're looking at it through. So they might want to send that nasty message right now to their email list, or put it on their Facebook, or kind of cut that negative ad. But they might realize in this moment right now that actually harms them more than it does help. But I think there's a time at which, as we progress here, that changes a bit. And I think we do go back to the mean.
So, Jeff, this raises the question that I know you've asked students forever, which is, why be good? Why should a candidate or any of us be ethical in this moment or any other?
Right. That's a long-standing question. It's kind of above my pay grade, I think, actually. I flirt with it. But on the simplest level, there are tactical reasons to be ethical, right? And not just to be ethical, but to be perceived by reasonable people as being ethical, right? That probably is in your medium-term interest, even if it's not always in your short-term interest. So oftentimes these questions, should I be ethical, are really about medium-term or long-term versus short-term, right? Philosophers, of course, like to talk about situations where doing the right thing really truly isn't going to be in your long-term interest. Should you still do it? I don't have a knockdown argument for why you should, but there's an awful lot of smart philosophers who seem to think that argument is waiting in the wings for us. When it comes to campaign tactics, Shane, you said that it's common for people to say, well, but my opponent is doing it. Why shouldn't I do it? My opponent is doing it. That shouldn't actually be the test. The test shouldn't be whether your opponent is doing it. The test should be, would I be infuriated? Would I be aggrieved, right, if my opponent did it, right? And if you are aggrieved, then you probably shouldn't do it, because otherwise there's kind of a race to the bottom. But I recognize it's difficult if you really think this is a make or break tactic for my campaign, and I'm fighting with one hand tied behind my back. That's really tough. I don't envy you your job at all, Shane, if you're trying to be the voice of ethics for people who are running campaigns. I have the luxury of talking about it in the ivory tower, but in the real world, I don't know. I wish, Peter, I had a knockdown argument I could give you. Here's why it's always going to work out for the best. This is what Pangloss says, and right? It's always going to work out for the best if you do the right thing. But,
I just have a couple of thoughts. One week, this subject too big probably for this debate, but the metastasis of money in politics certainly encourages bad behavior, because you don't see people spending hundreds of millions of dollars to tell me how my opponent is a wonderful person. That's just not happening. And so but that's something that, maybe this is all going to change that. I don't know. The other thing is that there are good practices of behavior. It's just that we don't extol them very much. When John McCain told that woman who called Barack Obama, whatever, a Muslim or even worse things, and he said, no, ma'am, you're wrong. He's a decent man. He just believes differently than I do. And, that's gotten a fair amount of publicity. And I've always thought that there ought to be a book of best practices out there, or examples of good behavior that bear fruit. And we don't really talk about it very much, because the world we live in is man bites dog rather than dog bites man. But there are politicians who really do the right thing, who, this guy Chris Coons, senator from Delaware. I'm extremely impressed with him. He talks about high value things, and he doesn't really tear down the opposition. He tries to build relationships. And somehow we've got to figure out a way to expand that, and expand the knowledge of that, and expand the public's knowledge of those kinds of acts of good behavior.
Can I follow up on that? Can I follow up on that with a favorite example of mine, in the spirit of bipartisanship here, that I'm old enough to remember when George H.W. Bush and Dan Quayle conceded to Bill Clinton. and I'm going to paraphrase here, but my recollection is that Dan Quayle said to his fellow citizens, if Bill Clinton runs the country as well as he ran his campaign, we're going to be okay.
Yes.
And I would love to hear things like that today. It's almost unimaginable today that someone on the national scene would say something as gracious as that. And this was after a very brutal campaign that had been quite brutal toward Dan Quayle, if you'll recall. So sorry to take us a little off topic there, but that's the kind of spirit of mutual respect that I'd like to see more of in today's politics.
So Shane, is there a role for organizations like campaigns and elections in that? What can people like you and me do to foster what Jeff and Dan are talking about?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think it starts with kind of forcing people to have uncomfortable conversations. And that's one of my favorite things with our folks, political consultants. I love getting them on stage and forcing them to confront things that they really don't want to talk about. In some cases, that's ethics. In a number of other cases, it is the serious sort of lack of not enough representation, not enough diverse voices at the table, particularly in the consulting world. I try to talk about that when we can at our events because it's an important issue. It makes consultants uncomfortable because frankly, it's an issue on the left and the right. But I think that as campaigns and elections, we're not doing our job if we're not making political consultants uncomfortable, if we're not making them confront ethical issues and make themselves ask questions about how they're running their businesses, the advice they're giving to their clients. I think it's critically important that we do it. And there's no way to force it other than just keep having the conversations and keep making them answer questions.
And I have to say, Shane has done a terrific job of this with campaigns and elections, and the idea that he would invite a former political hack ethics guy down to talk to a room full of political consultants who are also getting talks about direct mail, digital, and all that stuff speaks volumes about his and campaigns and elections commitment to being ethical leaders. Dan, I know you're working on this at Aspen. What role is Aspen playing in this?
Well, Aspen's goal is to create an environment of tolerance and respect. And it's easier when you're dealing with people who have fairly similar viewpoints. So Aspen's kind of got I'd say a moderate, it's not partisan, but it's got a moderate, probably to the left reputation. It's not that it's anti-right, but it's, although we have people like David Brooks on staff and others who are certainly more centrist. And, this in part starts with our public education system, where, again, getting into a whole new area where civic literacy is extraordinarily low, where these are not important values to be taught in our public schools because they don't have the resources or it's not viewed as very important. And also when people see other lines of work, not just politics, the business world, and the other worlds not necessarily operating in the best way, that the examples aren't great. But I go back to this point: how do we extol the examples, the people who really are doing the right thing, the profiles in courage, so to speak, the people who speak truth to power, who take on the system, who do the right thing, and do it not passively, but do it aggressively, proactively, even with some self-promotion. That can really carry the weight, the message. The one other thing I would just say is that this medical crisis we're in, where everybody's in the same boat. You saw Prince Philip, not Prince Philip, but Charles is exposed, and you got all these very rich people exposed to this virus, which makes us realize that as human beings we're all pretty much the same. We have the same genetic makeup. There's no way to be immune from all this stuff. Maybe there's a way to work on this issue that we're facing to democratize and soften the process a little bit. This is going to be an incremental problem and solution. It's not going to be overnight. We're going to turn into angels and saints.
Well, Jeff, as you know, I'm a huge fan of Aristotle, and I can't believe I've gone 45 minutes without name checking him. But back when he was writing and teaching, ethics, politics, and rhetoric were all the same subject, right? Because the only way to get through to an uncertain future is to come up with good arguments, debate it out, and sort of see where it went. And it seems to be that two of Aristotle's proofs are really relevant in this moment. One is ethos, the appeals to credibility, whether or not the public sees you as a good person, whether or not they're going to believe you, and also the idea of saying the right thing in the right moment, right? The idea of kairos is terrifically important. How do we, from your perspective, you've got feet in the philosophy department and the Trachtenberg School, JD, PhD. Are there ways that we at GW or other universities can do what Dan suggests and bring back some of this teaching of politics as a communal, ethical, noble activity, and political rhetoric as a vital part of how we navigate our society?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think people like you are doing this. People with a foot in a communication school, but active scholarly interests in the rhetorical tradition. Some of this happens in philosophy departments, but philosophy departments are highly professionalized and isolated. I don't know that much of it happens in the Trachtenberg School, although there are a lot of people with terrific values at the Trachtenberg School. Political science, of course, is highly technocratic at this point, and I think to expect political scientists to recover the rhetorical tradition is probably not realistic at this point. It's a tough nut to crack. I think it is going to happen, if it's going to happen, with people like you who are at the interstices, the academic interstices, and who play a little bit by their own rules and aren't afraid to say, hey, Aristotle's relevant to your world. Philosophers frequently just want to study the old texts and write for each other. So that's one of the things that excites me about your agenda and about the project on political communication ethics is that you're not afraid to get your hands dirty, but you're also not afraid of the library. And I think that's rare. But yeah, so it's on you, Peter, is what I'm saying. All on you.
No,
I'll help if I can. It's on you.
So Shane, help me out here. If it's on me, I'm gonna. That sound you're hearing is the buck passing. How do people like me and Jeff help back you up? And how do people like Dan, given his experience and his perch at Aspen, help the day-to-day city council, mayoral, county level candidates do this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's twofold, right? I think for folks that are coming into the world of political communications and political consulting and running campaigns, this is something that really needs to be part of the conversation very early on, right? Because there are so many young folks in the world of politics right now. So many folks are volunteering on a campaign, and in the last 2 to 4 years, maybe they were a regional field director somewhere, and all of a sudden the next cycle they seem to own their own political consulting firm, right? So there's such opportunity right now. There are so many campaigns that are raising so much money. To the secretary's earlier point about money in politics, that's enabling more political consulting firms. It's enabling more avenues for communication, and I think it's critically important that folks are talking about the ethics of everything that they're doing before they start actually practically doing it as a job, right? And I'm not entirely convinced that's happening. In fact, I'm pretty certain it's not happening anywhere near as much as it needs to be. I guess from my perspective at campaigns and elections, we're a little bit latecomers to that, because by the time you're reading us, presumably you're already in this world. You're already working on campaigns, right? So we're doing the best we can to keep that conversation up, force people to ask themselves these questions and to be presented with some of these difficult sort of scenarios and be thinking about their role in this. And that's what we can do.
I've taught a couple of courses at the Graduate School of Political Management at GW, and I think we've talked about this with the students, at least in the classes that I've been into, and I've been impressed with that. From a bigger perspective, I have to tell you that I worry about all this in the larger context of the role of America in the world, because I do think we're not a perfect nation by any stretch of the imagination, but we have stood for these values of freedom and liberty and how to treat each other. And because the golden rule's kind of been part of our Constitution. And you look at the founding fathers, this was all part of how they created all of these documents. And if we get away from it too far, it's going to have an impact on American leadership in the world. And without American leadership in the world is really going to be in a lot more trouble than it is right now. So it's a bigger problem than I mean, it starts with how we conduct ourselves personally, how we conduct ourselves campaign-wise, but then it's how we conduct ourselves as a country too.
That's a great way to end, I think. And with an eye to the clock, we could have this conversation. This could go on. I look forward to having this conversation in person at some point over a meal when we're all allowed to do that again. But before we wrap this up, I do want to ask you if you have any parting words of wisdom on ethics and campaigning in this moment. I want to go, let's start the order we started in and end with the philosopher and start with Secretary Glickman. Dan, what do you think? Parting words?
I think one of you needs to write a book that is the book of encyclopedia of great ethical leaders in America and the world, and grade them in a way. And a little bit like we grade restaurants or grade universities, or US News grades medical schools. I mean, I do think that people respond to how others look at them. So if one of you writes that book, I'll do my best to promote it.
Shane?
Well, I'm certainly not the best place to write that book, but I would love to read it. I think my last thought is, for folks working on campaigns and candidates and anybody who's in that infrastructure who may be listening to this conversation, really do think thoughtfully about digital campaigning at this moment, right? It's something that has gotten increasingly invasive over the past few cycles. There are more privacy concerns. I think we need to be careful about that in particular at this moment. You may be trying to substitute, offline interactions, bring them online, but we do have to be careful as folks have serious, economic and health concerns, not to be doing things that feel more invasive, that feel sort of like we are taking advantage of that moment. So I think be careful with your digital messaging and think as thoughtfully as you can about that.
So for the big think, final thoughts, Professor Brandt.
My final thought would be that now more than ever, candidates should be making ethics part of their brand, that should be a selling point. They should seek out people who will celebrate that they do that, but their whole staff should internalize that message. Ethics is part of our brand. It's part of who we are as a candidate, now more than ever.
Great final thought to end on. Thank you all, gentlemen, very much.
Thank you for putting it together, Peter.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.